Natalie Kayajanian. I'm the Director of Translational Research at the Foundation for Prader-Willi Research. And I'm also the Executive or Director of the Prader-Willi Syndrome Clinical Trial Consortium. And Lauren?
Yes, I'm Lauren Schwartz-Roth, and I'm part of the SPWR research team. I'm also a psychologist on the faculty in rehabilitation medicine at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I'm also the mother of a spunky 18-year-old young lady with Prader-Willi syndrome.
Thank you. So I would like also to thank Jessica Bohonowicz, who is on the line. She's the Associate Director of Grant Program, and she will be managing the technical aspects of this webinar. And I wanted to make sure that you know that this webinar is being recorded, and you are very welcome to type your questions through the control panel that should appear on your screen. And all the questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. So we are really pleased today to present the study that we performed within the PWS Clinical Trial Consortium on assessing the caregiver burden in PWS. So I would like just here to give you a very brief overview of the PWS Clinical Trial Consortium. It's a collaborative, pre-competitive, and international consortium that was launched in July 2015 during a workshop we organized to discuss on challenges as well as solutions of current and future clinical trials for PWS. It is composed of stakeholders from industry, academia, and patient organizations, including the Foundation for Prader-Willi Research, PWS USA, the International Prader-Willi Syndrome Organization, and Prader-Willi France. And the goal of this consortium is really to accelerate clinical trials for PWS by addressing key challenges, including better understanding the natural history of the syndrome, develop outcome measures to assess treatment efficacy, for example, better clinical trial endpoints to measure efficacy of the treatment against hyperphagia, and develop structured methods to incorporate the patient and the caregiver's voice into the development of new treatment. And the study we are presenting today is part of this latter goal. So the working group members who have developed this study are indicated at the bottom of this slide. And this working group has developed a survey last year to measure caregiver burden in Prader-Willi syndrome. And before we discuss about the results, we would like to thank all the participants of this study, without whom this study would not have been possible. So thank you very much. So measuring caregiver burden in PWS.
Natalie, I'm sorry to interrupt, but your slides are not showing up. Can you double check that you have the presentation open?
Now it is, no?
Yes, now, yes. Great, thank you.
Sorry, I think I said everything that was on the first two slides. So this is the third slide. So measuring caregiver burden in PWS has two goals. The first goal is to measure the social, the financial, the psychological, and the health impacts of PWS on the caregivers to better understand ways in which their lives are affected, and also to help guide the development of support tools for caregivers and their families. And Lauren will discuss more in details about the results of our survey regarding this goal during the first part of this webinar. The second goal is to evaluate the PWS caregiver burden as a measure indicative of the treatment outcomes for the individuals with PWS enrolled in clinical trial. And I will be discussing about this part as well as the second survey we are launching today during the second part of this webinar. Lauren?
Okay. So today I'm going to talk about Study 1, the first Prader-Willi syndrome caregiver burden survey that we developed, which was an online anonymous self-report survey that had a total of 59 questions. And for this study, the working group created a survey to assess the impact of Prader-Willi syndrome on the primary caregiver, by reviewing existing literature regarding assessment of caregiver burden. We ended up choosing the Zarit Burden Inventory, which is a 22-item questionnaire which asks how the caregiver feels about various aspects of taking care of a person with a chronic medical condition or disability. The Zarit Burden Interview we chose because of its widespread use in other populations, and it has very good reliability and validity. We added a few other questions to ask about the impact of Prader-Willi syndrome on the caregiver's quality of life, including mental and physical health, romantic and marital relationships, as well as how the caregiver's work life has been affected, how much help they're receiving for their child, and their finances. And the data I'm going to talk about today focuses on 142 caregivers who reside in the United States. Next slide. So this shows a little bit about some of the demographic information for the sample. The majority of the caregivers who completed the survey were mothers. 81% were married or living with their significant other, and the age range for the person with Prader-Willi syndrome they were providing care for was 2 months to 52 years of age. Approximately 90% of the people with Prader-Willi syndrome were still living at home with their caregiver. Next slide. Now looking at the results for the Zarit Burden Inventory, the mean for Prader-Willi caregivers in this sample was 44.36. On the right side of the slide, you can see a graph which shows different burden categories used for the Zarit questionnaire. And as you can see, a large majority of caregivers, about 56%, had scores above 40, which is considered in the moderately high to high burden range. On the bottom of the slide, you can see that the mean for the Prader-Willi caregiver sample was quite a bit higher as compared to other caregiver samples, such as caregivers for people with dementia, stroke, and acquired brain injury. Also not on this slide, there is a recent study of caregivers for individuals with autism using some of the subscales of the Zarit inventory that also found moderately high to high levels of caregiver burden, similar to what we found in the present study. Next slide. Next, we analyzed whether caregiver burden could be different in the different Prader-Willi age groups. And we separated the people with Prader-Willi into 5 different age groups, ranging from 0 to 4 years of age in the youngest group to 31 and above in the oldest group. And these analyses showed that caregiver burden peaks in the teen and younger adult Prader-Willi age groups and is significantly higher than the burden scores in the youngest group. It does look from this graph like burden may decrease in the oldest group, but the number in this group is quite small, so we really need to gather more data in this age group to see if this is a true finding. Next slide. Next, we wanted to explore whether the amount of help the caregiver is receiving with care for their adult or child with Prader-Willi syndrome impacted their sense of burden. We asked caregivers to rate on a 1 to 10, with 1 being not at all and 10 being a lot scale, how much help do you have caring for your child with Prader-Willi syndrome, either paid or unpaid? There was a small negative correlation between these two measures, so as the level of help increases, burden goes down. But as you can see, interestingly in this graph, even those caregivers reporting getting a lot of help, like looking at 8, 9, or 10 on the scale, had as a group still moderately high burden scores. Next slide. Next, we asked caregivers about their level of anxiety and depressed mood over the last 2 weeks on a 1 to 10 scale, with 1 being not at all and 10 being very severe. This is a typical way that clinicians do a preliminary assessment of mood and coping. On the top left graph shows anxiety, and this graph shows that about 65% of the caregivers in this sample rated their anxiety levels in the last 2 weeks as in the moderate to severe range, with a rating of 5 or above, reflecting moderate to severe levels of anxiety. These results are consistent with previous studies showing higher general anxiety levels in mothers of individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome. On the right graph, you can see the results for depressed mood. In this graph, 34% of the caregivers had mild feelings of depressed mood with a rating of 2 to 4, but almost half, 45% of the caregivers reported depressed mood in the moderate to severe range over the last 2 weeks. And on the bottom of the slide reflects a graph with answers to a question. Please rate the degree to which having a child with Prader-Willi syndrome has negatively affected your marriage or romantic relationship. Here we found that 65% of the sample reported a moderate to severe negative impact on their relationship with scores of 5 or less. These mood and relationship impact results are strikingly high for this non-clinical sample of caregivers. Next slide. Finally, we asked about impact on the impact of PWS on caregivers' sleep and work. We asked the question, yes or no, I get less sleep because of my child with Prader-Willi syndrome. 61% of the caregivers reported that their sleep is affected due to their child with Prader-Willi. And remember, this is a sample that had a lot of older children and young adults in it. We also assessed the impact of the Prader-Willi on the caregiver's work. So on the right side of the slide, we asked how many caregivers or their spouses had made changes to their work because of their child with Prader-Willi, either working less, changing jobs over their career path, needing to work more for home, etc. And a very high percentage reported changes to work due to Prader-Willi, almost 90%. Next slide. So in conclusion, Prader-Willi caregivers experience moderate to high levels of caregiver burden. Caregiver burden appears to be the highest for caregivers whose children and adults were in the teenage and younger adult age groups. The caregivers also reported significant negative impacts on quality of life, namely their sleep, mental health, romantic relationships, and work. This study shows that parent caregivers of individuals with Prader-Willi likely represent an underserved clinical population who warrant attention and intervention in their own right. Next slide. So, what do we do? Prader-Willi syndrome is very challenging for caregivers, as we've seen from this study. In a moment, Natalie's going to talk about next steps in terms of important research in this area. But I want to take a few minutes now to talk about what you might do now or in the near future, like maybe after this call today, if you are a caregiver, to help buffer yourself or your partner from some of these difficult impacts. First and foremost, if caring for a person with Prader-Willi feels hard, it's because it is hard. It's important to remind yourself it's not just that you're doing something wrong or you need to be more educated or learn more. In a way, you have to give yourself a break. This is really hard, no matter how fantastic of a parent you are. It is also important to have a low bar for getting help and support. If you're struggling at all with frequent low mood and or feelings of anxiety, talk to somebody. Find a good caring friend, talk to your primary care doctor, or even find a therapist. You can ask for a recommendation. I highly recommend that from someone you know. Or you can call your state chapter of the Psychological Association. They can provide you a list of licensed providers. And you can even ask them for somebody who might specialize in working with parents of children with special needs. A previous study of general caregivers, not Prader-Willi, but other caregivers, showed that a Zarit Burden score of around 25 was a cutoff for caregivers to be at risk for depression. And if you recall, the mean score in this study was 44, so well above the cutoff. So since we know that the risk is there, think about ways to buffer yourself against possible depression or anxiety problems by using active coping strategies such as those listed on the bottom of the slide or other things you might come up with. I like to think about some of the important strategies using the acronym C, sleep, exercise, and engage. Sleep is the foundation to our overall physical and mental health. If you can only do one thing, try to make improvements in this area. There are lots of non-medication strategies that can be helpful. You can look up online sleep hygiene strategies. You can try to create a bedtime ritual that you use every night to help relax you before you go to sleep. Or you can look into using some sleep-specific meditation or relaxation strategy apps. There are many out there for this. Explore some possible options. Try it for a while. If you're still not able to sleep, talk with your doctor about other ideas. Number 2, exercise. If there's one panacea out there for coping, it's exercise. This is probably the best active coping strategy there is. It's excellent for physical and mental health. Multiple research studies have shown this. And it does not have to be rigorous. If you're into soul cycling or boot camp, go for it. That would be great. But if you don't have the time or energy for that, as little as 20 to 30 minutes a day of walking has shown in research to improve depression and anxiety, as well as decrease certain pain conditions. And the last E, very important, is engage. But before you can engage, it's helpful to get respite care. Now, how to find child care or adult care could be a whole other webinar. It's a complicated and challenging process for those of you caregivers out there, I know personally. But briefly, try to be creative, tap all of your resources and anyone you know. The least likely person may be a great caregiver for your child with Prader-Willi syndrome. And you need this care so that you can do some things to help yourself feel better, such as connect with other special needs parents. This can be a wonderful source of support. Find others who are on the same or similar journey. They get it in a way that no one else can. Also, make special time to be a couple. Plan date nights, and this can be something simple. You can do it in-home after the kids are in bed and just watch your favorite Netflix show together. This is a great way to try to buffer the potential negative impact on your relationship. And finally, turn your trauma into a mission. Get involved. Now, I'm not saying that your child is a trauma, but rather having a child with special needs and all that goes along with that can be very traumatic for parents in many ways, no matter how wonderful your child is. Turning your trauma into a mission is a very common therapeutic approach for people who've undergone difficult experiences. That is, take that experience and do something positive or proactive with it, no matter how big or small, such as become active in a patient advocacy group, advocate for people with disabilities in your school system, educate others about your child's condition or disability in general. Almost every special needs support resource out there came from a parent or caregiver turning their difficulties and challenges into a mission to improve or change things. This can be really helpful for mental health. Now, none of these things are going to fix Prader-Willi or solve a struggle that your child is having, but doing some of these things to take care of yourself and cope with the challenges, in a sense, puts more gas in your engine so you can go further to assist your child with Prader-Willi with renewed energy, strength, and perspective. So now I'm going to turn the webinar over to Natalie to talk about next steps in this important area of research.
Thank you, Lauren. So in the second part of this webinar, I'm going to talk about what is next. So building on the results of this first study, we would like now to test the caregiver burden, and the Zarit Burden Interview is a measure of caregiver burden in clinical trials for individuals with PWS. And the goal here is to incorporate the caregiver burden, the Zarit Burden Interview, as an observer-reported outcome, in other words, an exploratory endpoint, to assess the treatment efficacy for individuals with PWS in clinical trials. So the underlying assumption that we would like to test is that a treatment that will benefit individuals with PWS, for example, a treatment against hyperphagia, will alleviate the burden of PWS on caregivers and improve caregivers' quality of life. On this slide, this slide reports also the results of the first study that shows that the Zarit Burden Interview is, as you know, is high in PWS. Lauren also showed that the quality of life is impacted in PWS. In this slide, we wanted to look at the question whether the Zarit Burden Interview predicts PWS impact on the caregiver's quality of life. And this is what we show in the 5 graphs that are illustrated here. And on this slide, we look at the relationship between the Zarit Burden Interview scores, and this is indicated on the y-axis. And as a reminder, the higher is the score, the higher is the burden, in function of the impact, the negative impact of PWS on different aspects of the quality of life, whether it's the romantic relationship, the perceived level of depressed mood, the perceived level of anxiety, work, and sleep. And as you can see on these graphs, we found a nice linear correlation between the caregiver burden, as indicated by the ZBI score, and the impact of PWS on different aspects of the quality of life. So, for example, the higher the ZBI scores were, the higher was the impact on romantic relationship, the perceived level of depressed mood, and the perceived level of anxiety. On the bottom right of this slide, you can see also that the ZBI scores, caregiver burden, is higher for caregivers whose work and sleep are affected by PWS. So this indicates that the Zarit Burden Interview is a good indicator of the PWS impact on caregivers' quality of life, and that we can use it for future studies. So there are, however, a number of questions that we need to address before particularly sponsors can incorporate the ZBI into upcoming clinical trial. So the second survey that we are launching today is really to answer a number of these questions and lay the groundwork for future clinical trial. And among these questions, there are 3 main questions. One is, what is the ZBI stability? What is the caregiver burden score stability? Are the ZBI scores stable over time? And in particular, during the time frame of a clinical trial, which is usually 6 months. The question that we ask here is, given that nothing major has happened in the caregiver lives or in the individual with PWS, we do expect that the ZBI scores are going to be stable, but we need to check that. The second aim of the second survey is to look at the relationship between the caregiver's Zarit Burden Interview and the patient's symptoms and severity. And the question we are asking here is, what are the PWS symptoms and tasks that impact caregivers and individuals with PWS the most? The first survey showed that caregiver burden increased with the age of individuals with PWS and peaking during the adolescence and young adulthood. We do not know, however, what are the symptoms of the child with PWS or the tasks that are related to caregiving an individual with PWS that participate to the caregiver burden. So that's what we are going to look at in the second survey. And finally, we are also looking in this second survey at the relationship between the caregiver's Zarit Burden Interview and hyperphagia. And the question we are asking here, is there a relationship between the Zarit Burden Interview and the degree of hyperphagia? And that's a really important question, especially with upcoming clinical trials that are going to test treatment against hyperphagia. So the second study that we are launching today is an online survey that you can take through the PWS Global Registry. And if you didn't register to the PWS Global Registry, it would be great if you can do so, and in order to fill the second survey. This survey is composed of 69 questions that will be, we will ask you to fill these questions at 2 time points, right now, at the present time, and 6 months later. And the reason why is because we want to look also at the stability of the caregiver burden over a 6 month period. And the time to fill this questionnaire will take about 20 to 25 minutes. The survey is confidential and the results will only be reported in the identified aggregated form. So no identification information will be reported. And finally, you can find this survey on the PWS Clinical Trial Consortium. And as you can see on the right of the part of the slide, you can see also the web link. And on this page, under the tab that is labeled For Patients, are listed all the activities of the consortium that are aiming at incorporating the voice of caregivers as well as patients into the decision-making process. And as you can see here surrounded in red, if you click on the impact of PWS symptoms on caregivers, you will be redirected to the global registry. If you didn't register, you need to register first and then fill the Getting Started survey before you can fill the impact on caregiver survey. And I would like also to draw your attention to another survey that is below treatment preference in Prader-Willi syndrome that has been launched in fact this week to assess treatment preferences in Prader-Willi syndrome. And in conclusion, all these surveys are extremely important for the PWS community because it will help to build data on the caregiver's perspective using structured methods like the one that we described today. And this is extremely useful to build data that will be useful for regulatory agencies, as well as having a way on future discussions with insurance companies regarding treatment reimbursement. So we really hope that you will take the opportunity to fill the different surveys. And we would like to thank you, and we are ready to take questions now.
Thank you, Lauren and Natalie. We are starting to get in some questions. The first question is regarding what Lauren was speaking about in terms of finding qualified caregivers. Families have trouble with that. In particular, this particular person is mentioning that they've been through approximately 25 caregivers in the last 4 years, and only one they felt was appropriately competent. Do you have any guidance or ideas on how to find and or train appropriate caregivers?
Great question. And I think that, just to go back to the data I was talking about in my slide, I think that may be why we didn't see a strong relationship between help received for the person with Prader-Willi and burden, because I think it is so hard to find good quality help for your child or appropriate help that even when you have help, it may not, quote unquote, be that helpful. And sometimes it may be stressful, especially if you have somebody who is not working well with your child. So I struggle with this myself personally. As I mentioned, I have a daughter who's 18. And I've used multiple resources. Often the best place I found is hosting or talking to other special needs families in the community, not necessarily Prader-Willi, but families that have all different kinds of challenges, and kind of sharing caregivers with them can be really helpful. Those are usually people who are particularly interested in focusing on working with people with disabilities and special needs. And I will provide them with information that I've received from some of the PWSA meetings. A lot of the information from Jan Forrester and her colleagues at the Pittsburgh Institute, they have quite a bit of info about managing behavior, can be helpful. I usually ask my caregivers to read about that and talk with them through it. But it takes a while to get somebody trained up and to find somebody. So it is a big challenge. And I will say that I work in my work as a psychologist at the university. I work with adults with all different kinds of acquired disabilities, and they also struggle with finding caregivers. So there's a lack of good caregivers out there. I'd love to see a systematic kind of program for training caregivers. I think that would be a great thing to have in the future. Thanks for your question.
Okay, we also have a question, and I'm going to ask this person to maybe follow up while I move on to some other questions. They're asking if we could review the summary slide of the Zarit Burden results. The webinar will be available along with all of the slides, so if there's something specific that you're wanting to know about more detail about that summary slide, let us know in a follow-up question. If you're just asking if that will be available, it will be available.
Yeah. And maybe, Jessica, maybe I can add also that we are in the process of publishing these results also, so hopefully it will be also ready in the near future also.
Yes, and that I think addresses one of the other questions, which is can this presentation be made available for distribution to regional centers and to help with education? Yes, the webinar will be made available, and as Natalie mentioned, the study is being currently written up for publication in the literature, and so that will also be available as a resource. There is also a question about whether or not there's a I'm hearing a lot of background, I'm not sure who that is. There's also a question about whether or not there's a correlation between caregiver stress and the current living condition of the person with PWS. That is a great question, and Natalie and Lauren can follow up, but that is one of the components of the follow-up survey as well. I don't know if one of you want to touch on that further.
You mean the... Go ahead.
Basically, whether or not we're going to be looking at whether or not caregiver stress, caregiver burden is different for people living at home versus living in a group home.
Yeah. We weren't able to look at that in the first study because we had such small numbers of people with Prader-Willi living outside the home. But the next study will be really important for us to get large numbers involved so that we can have a diversity and hopefully a variety of living situations among the people with Prader-Willi, because I do think it will be interesting to see if burden is changed if the person with Prader-Willi is living outside the home for part or all of the time. Natalie, I don't know if you want to add something to that.
No, that's exactly right, yeah. We didn't have enough.
And then we also have another question, and I'll take the first answer at this one, Natalie and Lauren, and then please add in. But another person is asking whether or not there's a correlation between the type of diet that somebody may be following or allowing their child to follow and behavior stress on caregivers. And although we are not asking that in the caregiver burden survey specifically, there is a survey in the registry that asks about what type of diet you have tried and what types of diets have been successful or less successful for you and your family. And so by having this survey, the follow-up caregiver survey in the registry along with that diet survey, so these are exactly the types of questions that we can start to look at by pulling data from across multiple surveys within the global registry. So that is one of the powerful aspects of the registry. So I'm not sure if Lauren and Natalie, you want to add in further to that, but that was, I wanted to add in that we do have that survey in the registry as well.
And that's, that's one of the reasons why we wanted to put the second survey in the registry so we can be able to look at a variety of issues. And my guess would be that the diet would sort of be mediated by, or the relationship would be mediated by the behavior. So I think what you're saying is if there's a certain diet that reduces behavior challenges, does that reduce caregiver burden? And we might be able to answer that question in the future.
And somebody wanted to, as Lauren mentioned, indicate that PWSA does have training DVDs available to help with training somebody to provide care for your family member with PWS. That is a valuable resource that is available. And then the question, the person was asking about the summaries of the Zarit Burden was asking if you could review that slide, the summary slide about the percentages of burden. They did not quite understand the explanation. So I think this is the summary slide showing the Zarit Burden results summary, if you recall which slide that is. And while Natalie is looking for that, there's another question asking about the plans to examine these issues according to subtype of PWS. And again, that is something that we can do by doing the follow-up survey within the global PWS registry. The registry does also have a diagnosis survey which asks about what subtype of PWS your family member has. And so all of these types of questions about how burden correlates with various different factors or variables with PWS, these are all things that we could potentially ask because the survey, the follow-up study is being hosted within the registry. And all of these types of questions are asked in other surveys within the registry as well.
Is this the slide the person wanted more information on?
You're
it was
asking
a
about the
slide with
summary.
percentages.
Oh.
A summary slide of percentages that they, I think it might have been.
This one, maybe. Is there a burden?
Maybe it was this one. And if it wasn't this person, you can just shoot us an email and we will, you can follow up with you separately if it was not this slide. But if it was, let's go ahead and just review this one really briefly.
Oh, did you want me to talk about this one?
Sure. Well, I just sort of
I'm not sure what.
Before.
So the mean score, which is kind of the average score, was 44 for the Prader-Willi caregivers. The bar graph shows that greater than 50% were in the moderate high to high burden range of 41 and above. And the mean score in the Prader-Willi caregivers was quite a bit higher than is seen in other caregiver samples of adults with acquired issues. Are we unmuting somebody to ask the question?
G. Godo, I actually have unmuted you, so if you have a more specific question, you can ask that now.
Thank you. Yeah, on this slide, so what is the PWS score for the burden results compared to everybody? It's not clear to me what where the red arrow is pointing. Is that the score for PWS caregivers?
Yes, that whole graph is for the caregiver burden or the Zarit burden results for the Prader-Willi caregivers. Sorry if that wasn't clear.
Okay.
So those are different groupings of the caregivers in the different severity categories.
Okay. All right. That helps. Thank you.
Great. You know, I wanted to add one more thought that I had about training or finding respite care or caregivers. Is my own sort of personal philosophy is to try to find somebody who is structured but flexible. If you have a care provider who is rigid, two rigid people do not get along. So they usually end up butting heads with your child. So structured but flexible. The other important quality I found in caregivers is someone who does not take things personally. Who can kind of move on after an event with your child.
So that is all of the questions that have been submitted. If you have any other questions that come up, please don't hesitate to send one of us an email. Our research team is happy to help you in any way that we can. If you have questions about this survey or about the registry, please don't hesitate to reach out. and I will let Natalie and Lauren close.
All right. So thank you very much for your attention. And like Jessica said, feel free to contact us. And we are really counting on you to fill the second survey, as well as all the other surveys that are very important to really give weight to the caregivers and the patient's voice, as well as, mention the registry. Your questions were great and really illustrate, how important it is to do this survey within the registry and also fill the other questionnaires in the registry. That's a very important database that we are building, and that will be extremely important for research, as we hope we show you today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, everybody, have a great day. We will look forward to hearing.